Have you ever watched a movie that you heard really good things about, and then when you watched it, you knew that not only was it a disappointment, but that it wouldn't even take very long to explain why it is such a horrible movie? That was the experience I thought I had with G.I. Joe Resolute. But then I realized that I actually had a great deal to talk about with this film, because basically everything about this film is just wrong. Before I get into all of that, this movie is written by comic book writer Warren Ellis, which was no doubt a big reason why I picked this movie up when I was at my local Blockbuster trolling for cheap films before it closed down. And the film is also directed by storyboarder Joaquim dos Santos, who I knew from his work on Avatar: The Last Airbender. I think the first thing I should get out of the way is what this movie actually is. You see, I keep calling it a movie because that's how I saw it. It was on DVD. When you put it in and click the play option, it is an hour of continuous film. It is animated, and it's not as long as any other movie you've probably seen, but I still saw it as a movie. And while I'm sure I was aware of this before I bought it, I must have forgotten. But this was actually a series of short episodes that first appeared online and then debuted together as a short film on Adult Swim, before finally making it to DVD release. So although this really wasn't ever an actual film, I will keep calling it that, because that's how I saw it. So as you already know, I don't hold this film very highly. I think part of it is that I'm not the intended audience for this film. There's about a 30-minute interview with some of the creators of this film where they mention that this film/series of episodes is aimed at the kids from the 1980s who used to watch G.I. Joe. Other than about 3 months of the late 80s, I did not even exist back then. So as per the mouths of the people who brought you this movie, I was never meant to be the audience for this thing. And I can see what those guys were saying. If you were a fan of the show, you might go back to that show now and see a lot of stuff that you would no doubt make fun of. I've seen many people make fun of how the soldiers in the show never seem to die, which is odd when you consider that this is a show about war. But that was just par for the course in the 1980s. All shows were kept as tame as they possibly could be, so as not to upset the parents, who had more power back then than Voldemort, Darth Vader, and Lord Sauron all combined. So if you thought that that was a strange fixture of the original show, then you might find this movie to be something of a redemption of the old cartoon. After all, there are real explosions, real bullets, and people actually die. Except that I don't find this movie to be any more serious than what I've heard people say the old cartoon is. For one, exactly one of the main characters actually dies. It's some guy whose name I don't even remember, because he dies off screen at the very beginning of the movie. Honestly, if the creators of this film would have us think that this is more mature and adult-oriented than the original cartoon, then why go through all of that trouble if you're not going to kill off any of these characters? In a movie that is about a team of soldiers going to war with a large cult of heavily armed terrorists, you can't help but come away from it feeling that it has been kidified a little when all of the main characters manage to come away from all of the carnage unharmed. How is this any different from the original cartoon in any way? Sure, we hear an occasional swear, but I don't actually see that as the movie organically being a mature story. I see it as these oversized kids who think that because there is actual death in this cartoon, that it is somehow automatically more mature and cutting edge and adultish. That may sound harsh, and I really don't hold any ill will towards these gentlemen. But let's look at the facts. 1. Dave Johnson actually made fun of the original cartoon for its lack of bullets, and every time a plane was blown up you see parachutes opening, indicating that nobody ever really died. And 2. Dave Johnson claims that when he was a kid, he played with the G.I. Joe toys, and his Joes died, in his head anyway. So this definitely screams to me that this is how a kid thinks, that more swears, violence, and death automatically makes for a better story. Oh, and 3. We even get a scene where people are parachuting to safety after sabotaging some space balloons or something. In fact, with the exception of the one guy at the very beginning of the film who dies, nobody actually dies in this movie. I ask again, how is this any different from the cartoon of the 1980s? Now, I should say that I do not think that carnage, swear words, and violence will automatically make a story more adult or more worthwhile as a story. But the creators of this movie certainly seem to think so, and yet they still try to avoid it as much as possible. If you want to put your money where your mouth is, then have some of these characters die to illustrate that you really mean business. But let me reiterate, I do not think that going in this direction is what makes a movie great. This line of thinking is what led to what is now considered some of the worst comic books of all time in the early 1990s. Basically, anything Image Comics was putting out at its inception was following this same logic that the movie is. If we have our characters swear a lot, that's really mature, right? And folks, no. Just no. You know what would make a movie more mature? Thematic elements that should be explored more. There are really all sorts of ways that this could have been done. Maybe this could have been a story about one of the characters being forced to leave a soldier behind, and he has to deal with the emotional consequences of that, and how it affects him mentally. That is very simple, and there are all kinds of ways that that could have been done effectively as a story. And ultimately, it would have made me care a little bit more about these characters in the end. Speaking of these characters, I don't know any of them, like, at all. We see a chick with red hair. I don't know her name. I actually had to go to the interview with the creators to find out that her name is Scarlet. Okay, but maybe that's something that you could have mentioned in the film, yeah? I've talked plenty before about my experiences in my creative writing classes in college. If you wrote a story and it didn't make sense to the audience, or in the case of the creative writing class, your classmates, you weren't allowed to explain the elements that didn't make sense. If the story doesn't work, the story doesn't work. I should not be required to watch the interview with the director of the movie if the story itself doesn't tell me the name of a certain character. And this, once again, harkens back to who the audience of this film is. It's clearly not me. If I've only read one trade paperback of G.I. Joe stories, and that was over a year ago, and I put it out of my mind almost immediately after finishing it, then I guess I have no business watching this movie, because this is being made for the people who already are very familiar with all of the characters. So I guess these guys didn't think that it was actually necessary to name one of the main characters on screen. This brings me to maybe the biggest issue of this movie. It's okay to have a target audience. Every story and every medium has one. But the possibilities of the audience expanding 100-fold happen when you not only consider the needs of your target audience, but also all of the people who you might pull in who are not part of your target audience. What if this movie had the secondary goal, nay, even the primary goal, of bringing in new fans of G.I. Joe who never watched the original 1980s cartoon? This isn't that out there, because I can tell you that not nearly as many adults watch Adult Swim as the name of this program might imply. It's largely an audience of 14-year-olds who want to act like they are older than what they are. And I don't have to do the actual math to figure out that those kids were not watching the G.I. Joe cartoon in the 1980s. Besides this movie failing to even name important characters in the actual film, I just don't really come away from this feeling like I've had a chance to come to know any of these guys. Part of the problem is that there's something like 8 major characters, and then a whole heaping pile of unimportant unnamed characters after that. And this film is just under an hour long. This film definitely could have benefited from 2 things. One, it needed to be longer. Adding something like 30 minutes to this thing would have given us more time to get to know Duke, Scarlet, Snake Eyes, and all of the other guys who I guess I'm supposed to know automatically. The other thing this film could have benefited from is having characters with actual personalities. You know that trick where you can tell if you have a great character or not? I first heard this put to use by Red Letter Media when he reviewed Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. Describe a character without talking about what he looks like, what he wears, or anything physical or superficial like that. Describe personality traits, and if you can give plenty of personality traits and attributes, then you have a fully formed 3-dimensional character. And if you can't, you have a problem, like this film does. I guess this is just me having unrealistic expectations. If this is supposed to be the air quotes mature version of the 1980s G.I. Joe cartoon, then it's not going to actually be about deep characters and exploring those characters. It's going to be about action, bullets, and someone manly who is able to shoot even when his rib is broken, but then he can't even stand because of that same rib. Now, is that a viable way of telling a story? No. Is it going to bring people to your movie? Sure. That's why there's going to be a 6th Fast and the Furious movie coming out soon. But when I'm spending an hour watching a movie about people who I literally know nothing about, what exactly is the reason that I should care about this thing? Even if I was a fan of the original cartoon, is there really a reason I should care about this film? It fails as a story, regardless of how cool it might look as an adaptation of existing story or a series of stories. In addition to this film having too many characters and not enough space to really fit them, I just felt like this movie had too much going on. The terrorist organization Cobra destroys Moscow and says that more cities will follow unless Cobra Commander is given control of the planet. This is a pretty standard story that really isn't very exciting or interesting, because I feel like I've seen this happen many times before. Maybe if you have only seen Cobra Commander from the cartoon and he was extremely inept, then this might seem cool, but to me, it is just enough to make me yawn. Then the movie splits into no less than 4 separate stories that all somehow are crucial in stopping Cobra and Cobra Commander. Snake Eyes, who is the silent ninja guy and is maybe the only Joe character I could name, he goes off by himself to fight Storm Shadow, a fellow ninja who works for Cobra. Now, why is defeating Storm Shadow so important in the grand scheme of things? We know that Storm Shadow snuck into G.I. Joe's headquarters and sabotaged them, but that could happen again with another skilled Cobra agent, right? Why does Duke think that Snake Eyes, who is a pretty valuable agent if I do say so myself, going off on his own to fight Storm Shadow alone is a thing that should happen? Especially when this ultimately takes way more time than is needed. Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes fight. Storm Shadow dies. The end. This takes maybe 5 times longer than it really needs to, especially when you consider that Snake Eyes is mute. So the only way to fill the air so that it doesn't appear to be as boring as it actually is for Storm Shadow to talk incessantly and tell us things that Snake Eyes and we already know. Then we have another 2 agents who I do not know, and they are attacking the power source for the giant laser that destroyed Moscow. This ultimately means absolutely nothing, because we later find out that Cobra has another power source that is identical to the one that was destroyed. This just feels like a way to put the Baroness and Destro into the story, even though they serve no purpose here. And then we have this other guy who I do not know, and he is sent up with some red shirts to destroy this machine that is preventing satellites from working. Now, this actually could have been a good plan, and is one of the few things here that really probably should have featured prominently, except that the whole idea that the satellites don't work is nonsense. We are told at the beginning of the film that Cobra's attack made the satellites go out, but then we somehow have radio contact anyway. This is because a military organization as technologically dependent as G.I. Joe can't really do anything without finding stuff out on the computer. So the whole idea that the satellites don't work is redundant, because everything else works just fine. So this is the 3rd segment of the plot that is absolutely useless and has no reason to be here. The 4th part of this big huge plan is that Duke and Scarlet are supposed to go and destroy the weapons that Cobra is using, or something like that. Now, since the other 3 missions that we see happen aren't actually very necessary to the overall film, I guess this one has to be, right? But I just don't see how it is. If this movie had been actually good, then the major crux of the film would have been the focus of Duke and Scarlet, and seeing their relationship grow. We see at the very beginning of the film that Scarlet wants to stay with Duke, but maybe her decision that she likes Duke in a like-like kind of way could have come closer to the end of the film, maybe in the heat of a mission or something like that. That would have at least been more viable than the bullet fest that we got here. Anyway, after all of this happens, then it's time for all of the G.I. Joe group to go and destroy Cobra Commander once and for all. Now, Duke acts like this would solve all of their problems, but it seems to me that if this incompetent moron dies, then someone else could just rise up and take his place, right? Now, Cobra Commander, I don't even know if I have much to say about him. He says near the very beginning of the film that he used to pretend like he was an idiot so that he could force his inferiors to think. This makes me think that this movie is trying to somehow make all of G.I. Joe history from the cartoons be actual backstory for this film, even though it is trying with all of its might to distance itself from that cartoon anyway. So why not just give Cobra a brand new history where he has always been awesome, and doesn't admit that he used to be ineffective and foolish? Not to mention, I'm not even sure if this is a viable strategy to use in front of your own men, is it? I get that if you act dumber than you really are, it can throw your enemies off. But that's not what Cobra Commander is talking about, is it? He's talking about acting like a fool in front of his own men, and now he is done with that. Why now? What has changed to make Cobra Commander think that acting like an actual intelligent leader is suddenly a good idea? This is why trying to have your cake and eat it too isn't going to work with something like this. If Cobra Commander exists in this world, then write his backstory in such a way where he was always a terrifying villain. Because trying to think of a way where he was once inept and everyone knew he was inept just is not going to work, and it makes this film feel even dumber than it already is. Not to mention, and this is pretty crucial, he still acts like a fool. The movie comes to an end when Cobra Commander locks himself in a bomb-proof, bulletproof room so that the Joes can't get to him, and Cobra Commander tells Duke that he can't stop the laser from firing on Washington, D.C. But Duke is apparently a competent computer expert or something, and he just reprograms the lasers so that it will destroy the entire town of Springfield, where Cobra is hiding. Don't worry, everyone in the town is apparently evil, so it's okay. And now Cobra Commander can't get out because he was an idiot and locked himself in this room, and Duke destroyed the lock. There are a few ways that this situation could have been avoided. 1. Put the controls to your machine inside an already bulletproof, bomb-proof room. And 2, that is it. There is no step 2. This is why Cobra Commander is a bloody idiot. I see no way that he can even get out of this predicament that he was dumb enough to land himself into, but Duke apparently says that he did somehow escape. He says that the chamber was, and I quote, absent. Shouldn't the chamber, everything inside, and the entire town be incinerated? That's what happened to Moscow, right? This film is awful, guys. I don't think I found anything about this to be very enjoyable. That's not to say that it is entirely bad. I did like the animation, but that wasn't quite enough to make me say that I found this movie to be enjoyable. I don't know what else to say about this abomination. If you're a Joe fan, I guess you've already seen this, but I can't see how you would have liked it. If you're not a Joe fan, I would say don't bother. There are better films out there, but being better than this pile isn't very hard, if you ask me.